These testimonies, these testimonies are found in an anthology of poems known as the Therigatha. Their authors were Theris, senior ones among ordained Buddhist women, and they were called this because of their religious accomplishments. The anthology that collects together these poems, attributed to the first Buddhist women, is in the Pali language, and is included in the scriptural canon of the Theravada Buddhist tradition that today is found in Sri Lanka and across Southeast Asia, but also in Canada, the Americas, Europe, and Africa. A keen sense of oppressive social realities is everywhere evident in these poems. There is also a moral sensibility about the wrongness that the world, our world, is the way it is, with the social suffering that especially befalls women and the poor. The poems of the Therigatha often make us sympathetic with the undeserved suffering of women and the poor. The oppressive social realities that are evident in the poems vary, but all are premised on a presumed human differences. Some differences are culturally and historically specific, such as caste differences and religious identities. Others seem recognizable across cultures and time periods, such as differences based on gender, class, and age. Still others present themselves at the intersection of the culturally specific differences and the commonly shared ones, such as the plight of widows, as we see in a poem by the Theri named Chanda, which begins this way. In the past, I was poor, a widow, without children, without friends or relatives. I did not get food or clothing. Taking a bowl and a stick, I went begging from family to family. I wandered for 7 years, tormented by cold and heat. The poems, like Chanda's, make it clear that while the Buddha's first noble truth says all this is suffering, the suffering of the world does not fall on us equally. As the old doggerel verse goes, the rain falls on the rich as well as on the poor fellow, but mainly on the poor, because the rich has the poor's umbrella. Edward Said's question is Orientalism. Was it ever a good idea for us to divide human reality, as indeed human reality seems to be genuinely present itself into clearly different cultures, histories, traditions, societies, even races? And once having done so, how are we to survive the consequences humanly? Said goes on to say, by surviving the consequences humanly, I mean to ask whether there is any way of avoiding the hostility expressed by the divisions we make. For such divisions are generalities whose use historically and actually has been to press the importance of the distinction between some and some others, usually towards not especially admirable ends. With this insight of Edward Said in mind, I should come back to the phrase, the first Buddhist women. It's not that this phrase is false, but just that we need to keep it in mind. We need to keep in mind that the poems of the Therigatha wear their Buddhism quite lightly, and they equally avoid most specifics of Buddhist practice, as well as thought. In terms of practice, it may be the disciplinary practices of monastics or the mental training of meditators. We don't see much discussion of the specifics of these. The poems celebrate individual transformation that ends in liberation, but they give little specific instruction about how someone who wants to imitate the Theris might begin to undertake practices that can transform a person into what the poems celebrate. Perhaps what we can learn from these poems is how to attune ourselves to a sense of the possible itself. To open ourselves to sensing, to quote Heaney again, that a further shore is reachable from here, and to allow it to land us on the far side of revenge. Heaney's expression, a further shore, will probably resonate with anyone familiar with any one of the Buddhist traditions. Lots of Buddhist texts speak about going to the far shore. It might encourage our minds to run in the direction of just what this further shore means in Buddhist traditions. But if we were to do so, we might be like Nazaruddin, that wise savant of the Persianate world, an exemplary fool. It seems that at one time, Nasruddin was under a streetlight, crawling around on his hands and knees. A neighbor came by and asked him, "What are you doing?" He looked up and he said, "I was across the street and I pulled my handkerchief out of my pocket and my keys came flying out of my pocket and I lost them. I'm looking for them." The neighbor asked him, "If it came out of your pocket across the street, why are you looking for them over here?" And Nasruddin answered, "The light is better over here." The same way, when we're looking for the sense of the possible, and we find ourselves looking for how Buddhists have described the farther shore, whether it be in the Pure Land or Nirvana or some other way of describing it, it might be that we're going to a place where we think the light is better. But we're not going to catch a glimpse of how we humans can sense the possible, to sense in the midst of and despite all our fears that tomorrow doesn't have to be like today. To sense that getting to a farther shore is possible may require being able to describe, may not require us to describe that farther shore, except to say that it is not this. We need to describe the sense of the possible, the sense of the possible that strikes us, that we see in the Therigatha, is always evident there. I think that it's analogous to what the scholar of Islam in South Asia, Navida Khan, has written about in her remarkable monograph about Pakistan as an Islamic state, that Pakistan's inheritance is, quote, an Islam with an open future and a tendency towards experimentation. Following Wilfred Kimmel Smith, the scholar of comparative religion and Islam in South Asia as well, Navida Khan goes on to say that Pakistan's claim about Islam is more in the nature of an aspiration than a clear vision of the ends of that striving. Smith's analogy was that the idea of Pakistan that held the imagination of Muslims at the beginning of Pakistan as an Islamic state was that it was like a kite that was flying too high in the sky that was covered by mist and by clouds. You couldn't see it, but you could feel the string tugging your hand as you held onto it. It may be that the sense of the possible is like that string tugging our hands to kites that we can't see anymore, that we're being held and being pulled by it. For the most part, the poems of the first Buddhist women leave the specific of the ends of their striving to other Buddhist texts, just as they do for the specifics of doctrine and practice. They have reached the further shore that they set out for. There's no doubt about that. But they don't say much about it, except for phrases like every tie untied. The sasana, the inheritance of the Buddha, the teaching of the Buddha is done. They don't say too much more about it, what it felt like, what quality it had, except that they are free. Rather, like a forest monk of 20th century Sri Lanka named Jinavamsa, who put a sign on the hermitage that he built for himself in the forests of Sri Lanka, that they wanted to share this good news. Our Buddha's inheritance, our Buddha's sasana still leads out. In singular, the phrase is, Apasam Buddha Shasana Tawama Narayani Kai. The emphasis for me is on the still, that it still leads out. How does the sense of the possible, that is still possible to be led out, present itself? And this is what I wanted to share with you in the rest of my talk with examples from the Therigatha. I do want to give the qualification, however, that what I'm going to say is not by any means representative of all of the poems in the Therigatha. It's not a summary of their essence. There's a lot of things that are in there that could also be said about individual women, issues about historical evidence that they provide to us, particularly for the irregularities of their lives that the women built for themselves. But today, I just want to focus on the testimonies that they give to us about their own sense of the possible. According to some of the theories, sometimes what happens is a spontaneous refiguring of how they perceive themselves by taking something that they accidentally see as a metaphor for the situation that they're in and what is possible for them to do. One nun named Dantika puts it this way: having come out from where I had spent the day on Mount Gijakuta, I saw an elephant on the riverbank that had come out from the river it had plunged into. A man holding a goad told the elephant, quote, "Hold up your foot." And the elephant put its foot forward and the man climbed on. I saw how the untamed was tamed, how the animal was ruled by the human. I concentrated my mind. I went to the forest just for that. Put a gloss on it. The image of the elephant mahout giving the command to the elephant, hold up your foot, presented to Dantika what was possible for her to do for herself, that she could transform herself into someone that would be under some sort of self-command, self-control. Another nun that I'll come back to again and again in this talk, a woman named Patichara, tells a small narrative about herself in the following way. Furrowing fields with plows, sowing seeds in the ground, taking care of wives and children, young men find wealth. So why have I not experienced freedom when I am virtuous and I do what the teacher taught, when I am not lazy and I am calm? While washing my feet, I made the water useful in another way. By concentrating on it, move from the higher ground down. Then I held back my mind, as one would do with a thoroughbred horse. And I took a lamp and went into the hut. First, I looked at the bed, then I sat on the couch. I used a needle to pull out the lamp's wick. Just as the lamp went out, my mind was free. What I see in this poem is a number of stages. It's clear that Patichara has gone forth, to use the Buddhist idiom of becoming ordained. She has been living as a renunciant, but she's not experiencing what she was hoping to find. She asks herself, why has it not happened for me when in the world, when people plant seeds, plow the fields, results occur? Why have I not experienced freedom? Then this accident, she's washing her feet and she watches the water move from what she says a higher ground down. What we can see in this is an allusion to the larger story of Patichara and what happened to her in her life. The story of Patichara is one of the most tragic in the repertoire of Buddhist stories told in the Theravada world. A summary of it would be is that Patichara marries an inappropriate marriage partner, someone of a different caste than hers. She leaves with him. Through a series of misfortunes, her husband dies and her children die. As she makes her way back to her parents, she finds out that they have also died in a flood. She is overcome with guilt for the sense that what has happened to her husband, her children, and her parents is the result of decisions that she has made on how to live her life. The reference to when I was washing my feet, I made the water useful in another way could be to the fact that when she saw the water moving on the ground after washing her feet, and some of it went far, some of it went a middle difference, some of it went only a short distance, she felt that what was happening was that her husband, her children, and her parents had their own karma, and their destinies were not determined by her actions, but by others. You don't have to take that background story to make sense of what she's doing when she says, I made the water useful in another way. That she's taking something near at hand as a way of reframing how she's experiencing herself and understanding that there's processes at work here in which are beyond her control, but there are other things that are within her control that she can control, like as she says with another metaphor. as one would do with a thoroughbred horse. And then the last metaphor, it literally is taking the lamp to go into the hut in which she lives. And as she is setting the wick in it, turning it with a needle, she realizes that she can turn it out by turning the needle further. And that is what she does. And she frees herself from the remorse and the anxieties, the guilt that she feels over the state of her own life. If we look throughout Buddhist literature on meditation topics, I don't think we would find anything close to what Patachara is doing here, of finding something that is near at hand and taking it as if it's a meditation topic and turning it, making it useful in another way. But the result is that what we see in this is that the state of the sense of the possible comes from seeing something in the world, seeing the elephant mahout commanding the elephant, seeing the water move on the ground, and discovering in it something like that is possible for me too. And then running towards that sense of the possible that presents itself more or less spontaneously. For other Theris, the sense of the possible came through meeting another person, another Theri themselves. Quite a number of them speak about what it was like when their first meetings with particular Theris, particular nuns. One, Uttama, says, 4 times, 5 times, I went out from the monastery, heart without peace, heart out of control. I approached the nun. She seemed like someone I could trust. Another one, who doesn't have a name, is just referred to as a certain nun. She also locates what happened to her in the middle of a life of renunciation already. She says, it's been 25 years since I renounced, but not for a moment, not even a finger snap did I experience stilling of mind. With no peace in my heart, dripping with sexual desire, I entered the monastery wailing, my arms outstretched. I approached the nun. She seemed like someone I could trust. That phrase, she seemed like someone I could trust, that spontaneous sense of a connection to another person in which you allow yourself to be open to something that you don't know yet, is simply that they are someone that it feels like I could trust them, seems to be one way that the sense of the possible presents itself to us in this world. We want to just emphasize that we should note that the sense of the possible comes after the decision to ordain. Both Uttama and this certain nun make it clear that they have been ordained for a while, and what they were hoping to occur has not occurred. The sense of the possible seems to present itself spontaneously on, we might say, on the far side of failure. That they sense something is possible in the middle of their own sense of that they are failing at what they have set out to strive to do. We might compare the experience of the nuns, Uttama and this certain nun, with the testimony that Shinran in the Jodo Shinshu tradition also shared with us about his own sense of failure coming down to Mount Hiei and coming to listening to Honen preach. And for some reason, when Honen simply said to him, come to where I am, that what clicked for Shinran was there's a sense of the possible in what Honen was saying to him. Sometimes the first spontaneous trust for the Theris seems to have developed into or turned into some sort of reliance on another person. That the sense of the possible was seen in another person, not from within. The Theri named Sundari speaks about this, in which she comes to her preceptor and tells something about what has happened to her. She says, the eye that sees the invisible, I have cleansed through training. I know my previous lives, honored one. I know where I have lived before. By relying on you, beautiful Theri, you who are an ornament to the Sangha, the monastic order, I know the 3 things that most don't know. I know what the Buddha taught is done. That phrase, by relying on you, beautiful Terry, maybe is another way that we may say, where do human beings encounter the sense of the possible? In some sense that is outside of us, some sense when we see in someone else's eyes, their confidence that we can do what we ourselves are not so sure that we can do. Myself, reading the testimony of the Terry Sundari, I also remember the testimony of the Buddha's beloved disciple, Ananda, after the Buddha died, and when he made his way to the hut that the Buddha lived in which Ananda attended him in. And the words that came back to Ananda as he went through the daily routine of preparing the clothes for the Buddha, preparing his bath for him, the words of the Buddha to him saying, I know you can do it, Ananda. I know you can do it. And that sense of the possible, when Ananda wasn't sure he could do it, was something that came in his memory, but it came from relying on what the Buddha had said to him. In the Therigatha, we see that another way that the sense of the possible comes to persons comes in the acts of, in the mere act of living together with other people. One of the biggest surprises for me in translating the anthology that is the Therigatha was the discovery that underneath the formal arrangement of the poems into chapters that are ordered by the numbers of verses in each poem, there were other patterns and other connections that seemed to be so clear that they had to be intentionally arranged in that way, even though they cut across the divisions of the formal chapters. One of the most poignant discoveries for me was the discovery that there was a community of women that was living together, and what they held them together was a shared tragic experience of experiencing the death of a child. This community of women who were brought together, like almost like a self-help group of people suffering some terminal illness, was presided over by the nun that we've already met, Patachara, who turned the water running onto the ground as a meditation topic in which she discovered the sense of the possible for herself. But what's clear is that Patachara, after transforming herself, leaving behind her anxiety and her remorse and her guilt out of a sense of responsibility for what had happened to others, presided over a community of women that were held together by her leadership and her instructions that they could do what she had done. There was quite a number of them, hundreds of them. And they are represented in the Therigatha as all speaking a single poem in unison before her. So the commentator explains that this verse was spoken by each of them, one by one, repeating what Patachara herself had said. She pulled out the arrow that was hard for me to see, the one that I nourished in my heart. She expelled the grief for a son, the grief that had overwhelmed me. Today the arrow is pulled out. I am without hunger, completely free. I go to the Buddha, his Dharma, and his Sangha for refuge. I go to the sage for refuge. That phrase, she pulled out the arrow that was hard for me to see, the one that I nourished in my heart. She expelled the grief for a son, the grief that had overwhelmed me. There's a long narrative of self-transformation that's in that verse of what each woman had done for herself. But we can acknowledge that perhaps Patachara, her voice of another possibility, is what probably sustained these women as they oftentimes perhaps retreated back to nourishing the grief that was in her heart. And Patachara kept on beckoning them to come forward, to go to another possibility. Another way, but the sense of the possible, the possibility that the life I am living today doesn't have to be the life that I lead tomorrow. It's seen in the verse of Chanda that I already read the first lines from. She is the widow without children, without friends or relatives, who's living on the street without food or clothing. I should say that within the society that Chanda finds herself in, to be a widow without children is to find oneself utterly alone in the world. No one will share the burdens of taking care of you, to share the burdens of getting food and shelter together. So this is where Chanda describes herself. Read again what I've just read before. In the past, I was poor, a widow, without children, without friends or relatives. I did not get food or clothing. Taking a bowl and stick, I went begging from family to family. I wandered for 7 years, tormented by cold and heat. Then I saw a nun as she was receiving food and drink. Approaching her, I said, "Make me go forth to homelessness." And she was sympathetic to me. And Patichara made me go forth. She gave me advice and pointed me towards the highest goal. I listened to her words, and I put into action her advice. That excellent woman's advice was not empty. I know the 3 things that most don't know. Nothing fouls my heart. The narrative that's contained in this poem, for me, is a very stark one. A woman living on the street, anxious about how to survive, sees another person that she perceives as also begging for food. It happens to be a Buddhist nun collecting alms. She sees her receiving alms, has the thought, she has a better scam than I do. I need to learn what she is doing in order to be able to get food the way she does. And she says, approaching her, I said, "Make me go forth to homelessness." The idiom here is ironic in some sense. Chanda is homeless when she goes to her. The phrase, "make me go forth to homelessness," of course, is the Buddhist idiom for asking for ordination. But for me, the important phrase is, "and she was sympathetic to me, and Patichara made me go forth." That phrase, "she was sympathetic to me," I take to be indicating that Chanda realizes that Patichara saw a sense of the possible for Chanda that Chanda herself could not see, and she gave it to her. She didn't ask Chanda to change who she was. She just invited her as she was into another way of being, that gradually Chanda came to realize the sense of the possible that Patichara saw from the beginning, but that Chanda only gradually came to see. But we can say here that the sense of the possible begins in this narrative in the recognition of oneself, in the recognizing eyes of someone else who sees oneself in the act of extending care to oneself, who sees oneself as someone that one can be, someone as I can become, not as who I am. So it's in that sense that someone else sees another possibility for me, that in their actions of being sympathetic to me, caring for me, taking me as I am, that I begin to sense a different sense of the possible for my own life. There's another way of living together that is not so tragic as the women living together, bonded together by the shared tragedy of having lost a child or having a child die. But the testimony of the women in the Therigatha, of their friendships together with each other. The more moving parts of the Therigatha as a collection for me was its celebration of friendship between women and among women. Some of the organization of the poems, what we can see in the background stories to them provided by the commentator, is that some of the women were friends before they ordained, and they continued to be friends after they ordained, and that they reinforced each other. It reinforced in each other the sense of the possible of what life could be in terms of the life that they were striving for, experimenting, trying to reach together. There's another way that the life together was itself how the sense of the possible presented itself. Throughout the Therigatha, what we have again and again are men around the women who are saying to them that what they are trying to do is impossible for them, or is something that they should not try to do. Sometimes this is by people who are harassing them sexually, inviting them to return to a life of sexual pleasures and enjoyment and sensual enjoyments. Other times it's from parents who are upset about them abandoning roles within the family. Other times it's from people who are just claiming that women can't do what they're trying to do. And so one of them, a woman named Rohini, her father asked her one time, what is it that you like so much about these ascetics that you are so eager to join with? And Rohini gives a whole list of virtues that she sees in the ascetics, about the efforts that they make, their experimentations, their strivings, their determination. But as she goes through all of the virtues that she sees in these women living together, the ones that she ends on, that we might take as what was the most important to her, is that she says, those who have gone forth are from various families and from various regions, and still they are friendly with each other. That is the reason why ascetics are so dear to me. What we might say is that in this poem, there's one verse, and she says, these people who come from communities divided by differences, different families divided by caste and class, coming from different regions with different languages and different traditions, and still they find a way of being friendly with each other, that this is the sense of the possible. It's possible for people to be friends across human differences, for people to support each other across these differences. And then Rohini explains herself using the terms of human difference to say, oh, this is what has happened to her. She says, I may have been born in a Brahmin family, but it's only now that I really am a Brahmin. I have the three knowledges. I am learned. I have attained the highest knowledge. I am washed clean. That phrase, I may have been born in a Brahmin family, but it's only now that I really am a Brahmin. That phrase, that only now I really am a Brahmin, is I've achieved what other people have claimed for being not only different from others, but superior to others. That she's saying, I achieved this by responding to the sense of the possible that I discovered in witnessing the way that other people live together as friends. So let me, in conclusion, come back to the thought of Leslie Kawamura's, with which I began. Every moment is in every other moment. That has to be our strength. Perhaps the sense of the possible, that feeling that we have, that tomorrow doesn't have to be like today, is a moment that is within every other moment. That may be why the poems of the first Buddhist women can speak to so many of us across the centuries and across the miles. They are products of their own times and places. They bear the traces of South Asia in the distant past, of Buddhist life in the distant past, very evidently. But we recognize in the poems of the first Buddhist women that moment when they sense the possible, when they sense that, quote, the further shore is reachable from here, as a moment that is already in our own moments, even as we stand, as we do, on the near shore today of conflict, fear, and anxiety. And when we strive as academics to understand how the sense of the possible happens in human lives and how it is built upon and how it is built upon, cultivated, shared, and also in those fleeting moments when we might read the poems of the first Buddhist women and find ourselves addressed, spoken to, then perhaps we will find ourselves saying with Leslie Kawamura that every moment is indeed in every other moment, and that indeed is our strength. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was very beautiful and timely, and we already have a question. So let me make a little adjustment here for the screen, so you could probably see this. Sorry, I'm trying to remove the pin so you can see the speakers, the questioners.
So David Collins,
Hi.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Lovely talk.
Okay.
I'm reminded with the shape of the sense of the possible on the far side of a failure or an obstacle of the story of the genesis of the nun's order to begin with, the obstacle being the purported disinclination of the Buddha to accept women into the ordained circles. And that in turn reminds me of the shape of the story of the Buddha being disinclined or hesitant about offering the Dharma on the occasion of his awakening and has to be talked into it, so to speak, by divine forces. I invite any reflection or comment you have on the shape of those stories, how they function in the tradition.
Thank you for the question, and it just raises a number of really, I think, important points. One thing about the Therigatha that I think is striking, that sense of the Buddha being disinclined to ordain women is completely absent. And we see nothing of, say, what people trace to his disinclination of, say, extra rules on the women, kind of the subservience of women to the male order. Nothing of that is there. So this is one of the places where it's a reason for me saying, oh, they wear their Buddhism, the poems of the first Buddhist women wear their Buddhism very lightly. They are not interested in that, that aspect of the tradition. In some sense, if we only knew the poems of the first Buddhist women, we wouldn't know that aspect of the tradition at all. And so things like the 8 heavies that women are subjected to, no reference to it at all. And if anything, what we see is an affirmation that the fact that the women in these communities are female is irrelevant to what they have accomplished. And in one of the poems, you have Mara asking one of the women, why do you think you can do what you're striving to do? You're a woman. And her answer is, what does being a woman have to do with it? And so that you could say is the general tone, that they're aware that there's a world outside that's saying you're women and you can't do what you're trying to do. And the answer always is, what does being a woman have to do with it? And what we, instead of us witnessing people following, say, the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, we might see something closer to a community of experimenters, or people who are striving and creating a different kind of renunciation that may be more historically accurate for us in terms of reconstructing the past of older Indian Buddhism than what we can glean from the rules and the Vinaya itself. The other thing, though, that you commented on is the idea that the sense of the possible has a kind of nearness or nextness to the experience of failure or the words of discouragement from others. It might be that what we see in this, with the request of Mahabhajapati Gautami and then the Buddha's inclination in the other stories, and it's also Ananda who is the one that intercedes. And what we can say from the stories of Ananda after the death of the Buddha, of his own sense of failure, out of the charge that he's not going to be allowed to come to the first council because he hasn't accomplished what all the others who will be there have done. And so it may be that the sense of the possible really is, the soil for it is the experience of discouragement and failure. And in that, the fact that some of the women, that they're very plain. I made a decision to ordain. I made a decision to renounce, and it didn't happen the way that I expected. And it was only after some sense of failure that this other possibility presented itself. That may be really quite important for us for understanding what they're trying to communicate to us. This is what they want us to learn from.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, I'll give people a chance to collect their questions and their thoughts, and I'll ask a question. So it's really I really am intrigued by your suggestion that this community is characterized by experimentation and friendship. So more, what we would call kind of an intentional community of practitioners who agree on their own practice, atmosphere, aesthetic, not necessarily rules. At the same time, you also have the story of the nun who is getting fed because she's recognized as a nun, as having a certain institutional marker, the robes and the shaven head, and being associated with a particular sangha. So, this is a continual negotiation. What is the relationship between support for a particular institution and a particular set of rules legitimizing the group, and the experimentation that comes out of direct, spontaneous attention to one's own practice and one's own environment?
The first thing maybe to reply has to do with broad historical patterns. And so one of the things that I think we see in both the rules themselves and in ethnographies of contemporary societies and in the evidence of things like the Therigatha is the existence in the Buddhist world of what we would have to call irregular renunciation. And so one of the things in the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, in the Theravada, is that with men, a man can ordain and then disrobe, and then reordain and join the community of other ordained males. With women, the Vinaya seems to be the case that when a woman ordains and then disrobes and decides that she wants to lead a renunciate life again, she can't reordain. She just comes and lives in this kind of renunciant way without ordination with other women who might be ordained as well. But we see again, in ethnographies or that today in the Theravada world where the ordination of women has been interrupted and restarting it is a huge problem, that women are still leading renunciant lives. So for me, in some ways, that what we see with the Dasasio Matas in Sri Lanka, or the Mechi in Thailand, other renunciant women in Myanmar, may be closer to the community. What we would say, the way they're living reflects what we see in the Therigatha as well. The people that are not so institutionally minded as we might expect them to be. Now, the perceptions of the people giving alms, that is an important thing too. And what you could say is that there's a tension that we see in ethnography and historically between the perception of people who are legally doing what is supposed to be done, and then people who are perceived to be doing the real thing. And so that kind of sense that there is a tension between, oh, this person is not legally legitimate, but I admire what this person is doing, and so I want to support it by providing the resources for them. And it may be the case that, the question about how lay people react to kind of legal niceties of monastic life versus practical, the visible practices that are there, is more complicated than we assume when we're just reading rules in different kinds of ways. The other thing, just to say on irregular renunciation, that the history of the forest monks in 20th century Sri Lanka is that we see a record ethnographically and historically of a great deal of experimentation. Quite a number of the monks who are famous as forest monks had been ordained in a legal, legitimate way and then disrobed because they didn't find the monastic order kind of conducive to what they were trying to achieve. And so the monk Jinavamsa put up the sign that, since I mentioned it last night, Wendy knows that I really love this sign, our Buddha's inheritance still leads out. That for him, one of the things he said is, I didn't ordain to make merit, I ordained to get out. And so that emphasis, I'm not, the legal niceties may not be what the people are striving for. And when they find them constraining, then they will go beyond them. The last thing I just to say as a academic, a student of religion, the issue of how to study human becoming is one that I would say we haven't really prepared ourselves well how to do that conceptually or theoretically, historically, ethnographically. We're very good at learning kind of rules, structures, cultures, and so on. But how to study human aspiring, how to study the kind of the urge to become something that you're not, we are relatively primitive in terms of doing that professionally as academics.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. Reiko.
Hi, thank you, Charlie. I'm not going to turn my camera on because I'm not fit to be seen. At one point you were talking about how many of the nuns draw on kind of concrete images or mundane realities like the water trickling down the hill or using the needle to put out the wick to give them a sense of what is possible. I was wondering if you connect that in any way to gender. Do you find that use of more concrete everyday realities to be more characteristic of the nuns versus than the monks nurses? Or alternatively, do you find it to be more characteristic of both the nuns and the monks versus in comparison to other types of literature?
It's a great question, Reiko. One of the, say, first issues, though, is that when we look at the monks' verses, that they're really quite different in their tone, character than the women's verses are. The Therigatha don't have any kind of descriptions of the social sufferings of the world. They describe individuals who leave the world and are happy where they have found themselves. They don't give very much information about what they have left behind. So we might have to look elsewhere for the question that the answer to the question that you're asking, which is a really striking one. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that, as we know from Liz Wilson's work, that the kind of formal meditations on the foulness of the body that we find in meditation manuals, oftentimes the interpretations of men on them is on the foulness of the female body, and not on the foulness of their own body, but of the foulness of the female body. And so what we might say is that the examples I gave of, say, Dantika seeing the elephant Mahut, kind of commanding the elephant as it came out of the river, out of the water, or with Patichara and the lamp wick and the water on the ground, that they turn these sites in the world into images to refigure how they're perceiving themselves, to have some kind of distance on their own lives and the possibilities in their life. And it shows them another possibility that is there. The men's meditations on, say, women's bodies as foul is not to generate another possibility, it's to try to shut down a possibility that they are feeling anxious about or threatened by. And so, but the larger kind of question on whether, like the perception of kind of everyday realities and making them have another use in something that is like an ad hoc meditation scheme, whether that's gendered is a pretty interesting question. And it would be something to, I say, well, to keep my eyes open for, that. But the initial reaction is whether the evidence itself might be skewed in a certain way that we couldn't tell by automatically on it. But there is a sense that what's happening in the perceptions of everyday life is that people are seeing some facet of it that makes us see it with a twist, and then changes when they turn it as an image of their own life. They see their own life in a different way than they had been before. And seeing things with a twist, whether that's gendered within the Buddhist traditions, I would say that's a large scale, pretty important question that I don't have an answer for today. Thanks, Reiko.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, David.
Of course, I've asked one already, but if there aren't others, I'd like to invite reflections. You mentioned, especially in the case of women, the element of the concrete in their stories, but a number of the examples you gave of failure were in sort of along the lines of failure of aspiration, or I can't do this kind of concrete. But I'm reminded too of the contemplative processes, especially in, say, a Via Negativa or many of the Zen school stories, a realization of the possible coming on the other side of the failure of discursive conceptual thought. Is it implied in some of the stories that the concrete circumstances affected conceptual sort of failure and realization on the other side of that?
It's also like a large scale and really interesting question that I would say I'm not going to have like a satisfactory answer this afternoon, but it would be an important one to keep in mind. At the core of it is, what you're sharing comparatively, that something has to, so the experience of failure is key to the experience. The experience of failure is key to achievement and accomplishment. And in the experience of failure, some sense of the possible presents itself. But what is possible may not be what you first imagined. And that needs to be something that has to be encountered. And probably different communities will describe that, we might just say phenomenological moment differently. In the Zen community, we might confirm the inadequacy of discursive thinking to describe like the encounters with reality that happen experientially. The Theravada traditions, as in the main, don't have the same suspicions of the innate corruption of discursive thinking that say the Chan and Zen traditions have. That there is some sense that language is capable of giving relatively adequate descriptions of reality. Whether or not we understand those descriptions or when we hear them is another question. But then there's another question that what comes to my mind is that you have some Theravada commentaries that talk about that certain people have, quote unquote, naturally awarenesses, experiences that other people have to cultivate through meditation. So one example is that parents naturally have all four Brahma Viharas. Simply by the experience of being a parent, that you have these. There's a kind of humor to, there's a beauty to some of the examples of how this is the case. And interestingly, all the examples of how parents have the four Brahma Viharas naturally are that they're given, it's mothers who have them. They don't give an example of how a father has it. But it says parents, but the example is mother. I'll just share with you the one on equanimity. I find humorous, and that parents have equanimity, and the example is a mother of a son, a teenage son, who is having a love affair with the neighbor's daughter, and she knows that all hell is going to break loose when the neighbor's daughter's father, the neighbor, finds out about this love affair. And she's indifferent to, she doesn't try to stop it. And so she basically wants the son to be happy, and she knows that, like they're going to be run out of town when it's found out. And she has this equanimity about not trying to choose which thing should happen. And so that idea that certain experiences of people either quote unquote naturally versus other people. One thing I have like a pause right away is say, wait a second, this is coming way too close to the women are closer to nature and men are close to culture kind of stuff. That it's just that, I don't want to do that. But it may be that we don't have to go naturally. We could just say, the social suffering, the kind of the sense of the impossible that is being told to the poor, certain, it can be some men, it can be women as well. That internalization of what others think of you may provide you with the kind of ground for to learn to have the experience, have the sense of the possible presented to you without having to go through the dark night of the soul kind of stuff meditatively. So.
Thank you. And we have a question from Ava. Ava?
Yeah, you hear me?
Oh, you have a question? Yes?
With regard to failure, I think also the life story of Buddha as we have it is an example of that. I think when he was, after the 6 years of trying everything under the sun to reach a kind of spiritual breakthrough, he was in despair and said, I'm sitting down under this tree and I will not move, even if I die. And then the following night he had it, yeah?
Sorry.
And I think also there is this failure that for 6 years, this man tried to achieve some insight and he couldn't, yeah? And so, yes, Professor Halsey mentioned the dark night of the medieval mystics, where also the dark night comes before the light. Yeah, I think that's something that is there. And Buddha in the life story, as we have it in the fragments on the Pali Canon, he's not that glorious hero who sails into enlightenment. He's a struggling human being.
Thank you for the comment. It's very opening to all kinds of other things. That it might be that when we think about like the standard blueprint of the life of the Buddha, that what we jump from the four sights and him seeing the renunciant, and he decides to go forth, and then yes, he like kicks around a little bit, but then it ends up on the under the Bodhi tree with enlightenment. And instead, what you're drawing to, you say, no, like we shouldn't rush too fast over the stuff of the failure. And it may change how we think about his experience with other teachers. It wasn't only that they were inadequate, but he was failing to get what he was setting out to try to get. And so this sense of him himself experimenting and saying, well, that's not it in some ways. And one of the things that you might have a possibility to say, we could be tempted to think about it as a before and after. There is a sense of failure, and that is followed by some other state. But we may also have, and this is part of, say, the testimony of someone like Shinran, that the state of failure and the state of accomplishment are coinciding with each other. They're not, kind of before and after necessarily. There's something that the moment of being a foolish being mired in karmic evil is the same as the moment of kind of experiencing the actions of, or being the vehicle of the actions of Amida in the world. So exactly what is happening in the relationship between the sense of failure and the sense of the possible is also, I would say, just a large-scale thing for us to not only look at in terms of textual testimonies, but something about psychologically, that part of the psychology of religion, of how this might work.
Yes, and that, Ava, did you want to respond or follow up on that?
Oh, thank you. I think that's a wonderful thing. And well, what I found very impressive in the Therigatha is that some of the Theris call themselves daughters of the Buddha born from his mouth, in the same way as in the Therigatha, the monks say, I'm his son born from his mouth. Yeah, so they both, the Theris as well as the Theras, claim that they are full heirs to the Dharma. Yeah,
that's right. So this, I think, is one of the really striking things, that the women are making claims for themselves. That when we know about things elsewhere of the Vinaya, they shouldn't be saying those kinds of things, but they give no recognition of those people who are saying, well, you can't say that, you're not capable of this.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then there's a way that they would say, well, it pushes to the background the other kinds of things that we may emphasize historically, the kind of subservience of the women's order to the male order. So we just don't see it at all in anything in the Therigatha.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you mentioned a kind of psychology. In your talk yesterday and today, I'm really feeling the psychological nuances of the Therigatha that are familiar to us now in the modern world. And one example that is your emphasis on the story, I forget her name at the moment, the one who is washing her feet and sees the rivulets of water. Patachara. So her sense, and I gather from what you're saying, that she felt guilty that her marrying outside her caste was the karmic cause of all of these deaths and losses. So, and I'm not a specialist on early Buddhism, but I don't recall hearing any of the monks saying, well, you know, I left my family and I feel guilty um, for things that might have happened to them. So this strikes me, you know, this ability to recognize it's not my karma, it's their karma. That in your interpretation of the rivulets running down, taking separate streams. It seems very complex and nuanced in a way that fits in more with modern recognitions about how the past affects people and is very difficult to understand and come to terms with.
That's right. You know, and I think it is actually very, very subtle and sophisticated on these kinds of psychological dimensions of our sense of that the happiness of other people is inflected at the very least by our choices in life. Probably many of us as academics can identify with that. You know, certain kinds of choices to move away or forego the luxuries of being an international arms dealer. Instead, that you just say, oh, that other people who've had no choice in it, I made the choice, but they had to bear the consequences of my choice, and that can burden people. I would say in the Theravada world, maybe even across the Buddhist world, you have portrayals that monks are burdened by this when they're aware that, say, their parents are destitute because they're deprived of their labor. And in a sense of, should I continue being a monk when I'm not really accomplishing what I thought I would accomplish? Or should I disrobe in order to kind of labor and make money that it can support? So that kind of tension between, in which you see that even with ordination, the kind of the not social connections, but the affective connections to parents continue that as a burden on people. So.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting that there is on both sides. So I see another question from Mitra Barua.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Alice, for this fascinating talk. I think somewhere in your talk that you mentioned that the contemporary or current academia has not emphasized or focused how to teach perhaps human becoming or aspiring, or academia has failed to teach its students perhaps how to become human or human becoming. So I would like you to perhaps comment more on that particular, your observation, if you don't mind.
What I'm aware of is that this is an invitation for me to climb on a soapbox that I climb on too often. And so I'm not sure that any of us have enough lifetimes for me to give this sermons. But the general point on this is that there's a way we could say, oh, we inherit a certain past of how to think about things that we call religions, cultures, historical periods, and so on. And part of that is that out of very good intentions, we are trying to understand the behavior of other people. Oftentimes, we might say at some distance from us in either time or space. And we might say the analogy would be is we thought that it was something like learning a language, that if we learn the grammar, if we learn the vocabulary, then we would be able almost to predict what people would say. And so that got us so far. And I'm not saying that this is not necessary and important, doesn't give us a lot of different things. But there is a certain area of life that it doesn't help us to understand. And in lots of things around the world, but for me, just as someone who has been trying to learn from the Buddhist world, there's lots of testimonies in the Buddhist world of people basically saying, I don't want to be anymore the way I am. And trying to say to ourselves, we don't yet know how to talk about that. We know how to talk about people describing how they are. And we can learn that and say, oh, someone like this is going to say this about themselves. But the concern about becoming something that you're not, it's only, I would say, maybe this is not unique to me. I would say lots of people have been trying to figure out how do we talk about this. And one of the most striking places in what people call the late Foucault, that's at the end of the history of sexuality, where we can see that Foucault, towards the end of his life, turned to this kind of issue, that how is it that people were not condemned to the epistemes that they found themselves in, that they were able to say, I'm more than that, I'm not that, I can be something else. And when he described, ethics as the self's relationship to the self, what he was interested in was the self saying to the self, don't be this way anymore. Like, learn how to stop being yourself. And how human being is, I have no doubt, I think that human beings do this quite a lot. This is something that humans are good at. But how to kind of focus our attention on it as an object of both something to understand, something to appreciate, something to admire, I don't think that we have gotten very good at it. And one of the things that is quite striking is that we often have thought that people want to become something that they already know what they want to be. Buddhists want to get nirvana. Muslims want to build a just society on earth. They know what they want, but that's not so clear. And that I've learned a lot from the work of Navida Khan on this, about Pakistan, that the arguments in Pakistan were out of a shared sense that we're going to become something that doesn't exist already, that we're going to show the world something that has never occurred before. They just didn't agree on what that would be, but they agreed on we're going to show the world on something that never occurred before. And so that, just as an object of reflection, an object of understanding, I think human becoming is like a worthy topic. And part of what I'm hoping is that you, Dr. Barawa, that you might say, oh yeah, I'm going to help poor Hallisey out and tell him how to think about that. So I apologize, I don't have much more to say except for, I feel that it is a lack of a blind spot in what we try to do for ourselves. So say, we're trying to understand this possibility that another way of putting it, of how we human beings find it possible to live in tomorrow and not only be condemned to today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hi, Beth has a question.
Hi, Beth.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
It's so nice to see you, Charlie. Thank you. I can't resist first to inform the audience, in case they're wondering how long you've been giving that particular soapbox lecture, that I remember sitting in a job interview in Van Nuys Hall in Madison 15 years ago. And Charlie told me this because my answer about how I would teach Intro to Asian Religions was lacking. It was okay, I got the job, and he was right. So I learned something in the interview too. But actually, that year at Wisconsin is the last time I've taught the Therigatha in any real depth, because I teach Hindu studies courses here. But what's really striking to me is that when I teach the Therigatha, I teach it, I emphasize what you did, the social suffering aspect of the voice of the women. And it strikes me that now when I teach Bhakti, that there's a similar gendered pattern, obviously, in the Bhakti saints, that the poetry and the hagiography of Mirabai and Andal refers to, or really almost relishes in the social obstacles they face in taking the Lord as their husband. What's interesting is, I think in Bhakti, we usually interpret that as almost an undermining polemic, warning women against renouncing, that it's a harder path for women to renounce in the Bhakti faith than it is for men. I never hear that argument made about the Theris, that, you know, that this just seems to be an idea of giving a different gendered view of renunciation and of liberation eventually. I'm wondering if you've ever considered that, though, that is there a similar gendered pattern to the Therigatha, that the social suffering is somewhat of a warning to women?
I would probably share what you said, that I don't see the Terries discouraging other women from doing it. I see them saying that not only is it possible, it's worth it. And that you know, that you would say, oh, there's perhaps a difference in the communities of the Terries than for the Bhakti, the female Bhakti saints, insofar as the saints tend to end up, you know, being like on their own. You know, that they have to make their own way, and that the story of the Terry is finding other people to make the way with, and that they're finding, establishing communities that are kind of outside of other communities that are creating all of the social sufferings that they have experienced. And there's a lot of them that you could say they're just sheer little poems that are sheer happiness to be done with, you know, having a husband. You know, I'm done with him, and I'm really glad to be done with him and stuff. So that's your point is like a really important one. It raises a lot of questions of A.K. Ramanujan had this, you know, kind of argument about that there were communities that were formed among bhaktas, but it may be that when you look at that, what Ramanujan wasn't really paying attention to was how much those kinds of images were gendered. It was about males, you know, kind of focusing on becoming female towards the deity, imagining themselves in some kind of female role towards the deity, and that the female saints are doing something really quite different. And I just don't know whether, you know, they have the same sense of bhaktas, you know, joining together, or that they're more singular as individuals. You know,
I love that essay by Ramanujan, and I should think about that. I think as I'm listening to you, I'm also realizing I'm conflating two different types of sources. So I know Mira's work better because I work on Gujarat, and in her actual poetry, there's no hesitation or regret. I would compare it to there's an enormous amount of pride and resolve in what she's overcome. So maybe it's the hagiographical tradition, which is sort of separate from her, that reflects, I think, a social pressure about women renouncing in the Hindu communities that I think is not present in Mira's own voice. So I should think about that comparison as well. Thank you so much.
It may be, though, that what you're referring to you see in the Therigatha as well is like the reflections of a social fear of female renunciation.
Yeah.
And that social fear needs to be connected to the really high-flying, large-scale argument of Stephen Collins that female renunciation is key to the very existence of civilization in the Buddhist world. And so just how those two things go together would be a kind of interesting track to try to go down. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that is. Thank you.
So thank you so much. And we're at the end of our lecture time. So is there any last question that someone would like to bring up? Well, thank you all. And I wanted to say to Professor Hallisey that, this has really made my Introduction to Buddhism class into a different event, because when I've tried to teach the Therigatha, or when I've taught the Therigatha in the past, the students really react. They focus on the negative portrayal of women, women's negativity towards their own bodies in the Therigatha. And that's something that really gets their attention and they struggle with. And so I really appreciate both your talk yesterday and today, yesterday for our class and today, because this gives me a whole other array of ways of coming at the text and discussing it with students in my class that I think really bring it into conversation with our world and our experiences. And it was always a very powerful text for me, but I found it hard to, bring that to my students. So I really appreciate your talk so much for helping me to do that. So thank you. And I think I'm seeing a lot of appreciation in the chat.
Right. Can I just add one thing to your comment? Because I mentioned it last night, but this is the poem of Ambapali is the one that Martin Wickramasinghe singles out, in which it seems like Ambapali is describing her body, her aging body, in a very negative way. Wickramasinghe makes the argument that she's not describing her body as saying, when I was young, it was beautiful, and now it is unattractive. She's saying, when I was young, my body was beautiful, and it's beautiful now. But addressing, like the rest of us, you just can't see what I see. And so then you could say that that poem is giving a sense of the possible. To say, oh, there's a beauty here that is possible that you just don't see. And that kind of argument that we keep on saying, oh, she has a negative attitude towards her body, that's what I see. Wickramasinghe is saying, no, she acknowledges that, but she's saying, you can't see as possible what I see. And so that just opens up, it's the opposite of what how I've been interpreting as a kind of negativity about the aging female body.
Why are you on here? Go. You need to clean your bag. Right?
So, well, thank you again. That's wonderful thing to take into our weekend meditations. And I'm going to turn off the recording. Anyone who would like to hang out and discuss, I'm going to hang out for a little while. But thank you all for coming and sharing in with this wonderful talk for the annual Kawamura lecture.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and being so patient.
Like, greatly enjoyed it.